Fanzine collection, which consists of more than 500 zines connected to the DC punk scene, ranging from the late 1970s to the present. And the curation of these collections, as well as my own connections to the local scene through bands I've been in and fanzines I've created since the 1990s, has led me to write a history of DC punk fanzines for Georgetown University Press, which will be completed sometime next year. So today I want to give you a brief rundown of that history, moving chronologically and giving you a look at a few of the many notable titles that have been published in the DC area over the past 44 years, telling you about what made them special, who the people were, what kind of impact they had. And I'm focusing primarily on the fanish aspect of zines, talking about the zines that were centered on the reporting of music, and which contain the opinions of fans on the bands, albums, activism, concerts, and culture that were happening at the time that the zines were published. And 44 years and 25 minutes means like I'll have to move pretty fast, and we won't be able to cover all the zines I would love to be able to talk about, but I'm going to do my best. So let's get started. The October 1976 issue of Cream, the legendarily uncouth rock magazine from Detroit, Michigan, had a brief, innocuous letter tucked toward the end of its letters to the editor section. And within this letter were the kernels of a scene that still thrives today. A writer named Norm from Fairfax, Virginia, made an oddly worded request. I'm starting a fanzine, amateur rock literate, need reviews and articles about intelligent groups by intelligent writers. Send your stuff. Norm DeValier soon started to receive submissions in the mail from Cream readers, leading him to realize he now actually had to go ahead and make the fanzine that he had talked about. And later that fall, he published the first issue of his zine, which he called It's Only a Movie. The first issue was mostly a mix of doodles and record reviews, but the reviews inside of the Ramones and DC's own Slicky Boys were both prescient in their awareness of a new kind of rock music and culture emerging. As Yvonne Carr's review of the Ramones' recently released debut album stated, the Ramones are masters of something new to come. For the second issue of It's Only a Movie, published in January 1977, DeValier declared his zine was a member of the NVAAGP-EP, the Northern Virginia Association of Avant-Garde Punk Editors and Publishers, a society dedicated to the organization and hype of everything avant-garde or punk. This association was clearly a work of fiction, and indeed, as DeValier told me when I interviewed him last year, I was trying to be funny. This issue also featured even more writings and reviews on punk, again covering the Ramones as well as Patti Smith and the Gizmos, using a rough-edged mix of illustrations, hand lettering, and typewriter text. DeValier's zine, It's Only a Movie, serves as the beginning of the DC punk fanzine lineage. And he moved to the West Coast following that second issue and published 2 more issues of his zine before shutting it down. But as he told me during our interview, he carried an important lesson with him from his punk rock days. Expertise isn't everything. Virtuosity isn't everything. And the impact of It's Only a Movie would linger on, as one of its local readers was soon inspired to start a zine of his own. Michael Heath, a self-described, quote, schmucky suburban kid from Burtonsville, Maryland, had struck up a correspondence with DeValier after reading the zine. And when I interviewed Mike Heath last year, he remembered It's Only a Movie as quite excellent, citing it and what was going on in London via zines like Sniffin' Blue as big parts of why he started his own zine, Vintage Violence, in March of 1977. There were 6 issues of Vintage Violence, although the 3rd issue never actually came out. But during its run from March 1977 to June 1978, Vintage Violence developed from a simple, handwritten and typed mimeograph zine into one bursting with great music writing and sharp graphics that dovetailed with the look of other fanzines from the wider punk subculture, like Search and Destroy from San Francisco or Punk from New York. DeValier's fanzine, It's Only a Movie, had predated Vintage Violence by a few months and can be considered essentially the first punk fanzine from DC. But Vintage Violence is more consequential in a way due to its longer run, and with all of its detailed reviews and writings on the concerts and recordings that were happening at the very beginning of this new scene, its more obvious immersion in what was actively happening in DC, to me, sort of makes it more consequential. Heath had wrapped up that historic first issue from March 1977 with the declaration that the zine had been, quote, operating under one motivation, the love of real live rock and roll. It's the hope of the staff here that people will get into what it's all about, and that vintage violence will become an important fanzine, all for the love of rock and roll. For all the mess ups in typing and all else that may be wrong with the magazine, it's done for that love of the music. Another key early DC punk fanzine was The Infiltrator. Published by Mary Levy under the pseudonym of Marie Provost, The Infiltrator's first issue appeared in early 1979, and the zine ran for 6 issues until 1981. When I interviewed Levy, now known as Mary Leary, she told me she felt her musical interests, most of which were reflected in The Infiltrator, were too broad to narrow down to her running what she would say was just a punk scene. Still, The Infiltrator provided striking visuals and excellent writing that covered punk in depth, from local bands like the Raz, the Urban Verbs, and the Slicky Boys, to groups from elsewhere like the Cramps, Reckless Eric, and 999. And The Infiltrator also stood out for its relatively professional approach to layout. It didn't look all that different from higher profile music publications like Unicorn Times, which was a monthly music newspaper in DC that ran from 1973 to 1985 and was often sort of a foil to the punk fanzines of the time. 2 of Leary's notable collaborators on the zine's bold visual aesthetic were Kevin Mcdonald, an accomplished and evocative artist who was widely exhibited both before and after his untimely death in 2006, and Michael Reedy, an exceptional and distinctive artist as well, who also sang for the Raz, one of the DC scene's earliest punk-inspired bands. Another DC punk scene from the late 70s was zines, and it too evoked Unicorn Times with its larger newsprint format and precise columns of relatively clean text. zines was the product of Tina and Howard Wolfing, a married couple that crafted a publication offering granular coverage of the local scene here in DC. And that was an approach that they borrowed from the highly influential New York City punk magazine, New York Rocker. Now, Tina's day job at the Chronicle of Higher Education enabled her and Howard to lay out each new issue with professional typesetting equipment. And as Howard told me when I interviewed him in 2018, without that free production work of hers, the whole thing could not have existed at all. So zines ran from January 1979 to July 1980, offering up loads of record and concert reviews, as well as interviews with Bad Brains, Insect Surfers, Tiny Desk Unit, and other bands that were strengthening the foundation of the new scene. One of the more memorable features in zines was an elaborate family tree that Howard put together that ran through the first 2 issues of the zine, tracing the development of the various bands that were comprising the young scene. But eventually, Tina and Howard felt they had sort of exhausted coverage of the local scene, and they ceased publication of these scenes. But a short time later, in March 1981, they launched a new zine called Discords. And rather than the really intense focus on what was happening in DC, Tina and Howard used Discords to look outward at the larger punk and new wave scenes, presenting interviews with bands like Black Flag, ESG, Circle Jerks, Mission of Burma, and more. And that clean, professional aesthetic carried over from these scenes, even more so, really. And despite the more global coverage offered in Discords, though, it was clear that the DC punks still viewed it as an important forum for what was happening locally. For example, when Henry Rollins moved away from DC to join Black Flag in the summer of 1981, Discords published what amounted to an open letter to Rollins's old friends in the scene, offering an update on what his new life as the singer of Black Flag was like. And as Henry writes here with somewhat disarming vulnerability, he says, quote, "It's really great getting to write this because it's like a letter to all of my friends. Sometimes it's hard to get all the letters you want sent out. I miss DC a lot." And as valuable as Discords had quickly become to the scene in even less than a year, it abruptly ceased publication in December 1981 when Tina and Howard's marriage came to an end. So unlike the more professionally inclined layouts of zines like The Infiltrator, zines, Discords, a new zine emerged in November 1980 called Capital Crisis, which was more in line with vintage violence, presenting a cut and paste layout with lots of hand lettering and typewritten text, and was more in sync with the aesthetic that was becoming increasingly associated with punk. Capital Crisis was edited and published by Zyra Harper, who, like Marie Provost, had been a disc jockey on Georgetown University's WGTV FM, a highly influential source for new punk music at the dawn of the DC scene. And Capital Crisis was almost like a paper version of Zyra's radio shows, featuring interviews with an eclectic mix of musicians like Tuxedo Moon, Joan Jett, and the Mighty Invaders, but it eventually hewed closer to the newer sounds of hardcore punk, which began to establish themselves as the dominant form of punk in DC throughout 1980 and 1981. And those latter issues of Capital Crisis feature interviews with Black Flag, DC's Black Market Baby, and had copious contributions from the teenage punks who formed the core of the new Discord Records community that would, for many, become synonymous with DC punk. But Harper's relationship with the younger punks was often fraught, such as when John Stabb of the band Government Issue and publisher of the crude, often offensive fanzine Critical List angrily wrote "Capital Crisis, Go Die" in an early issue of his zine. That group of young punks also pilloried Harper in a group letter they wrote to her before issue 4, and as they said, "A major complaint of ours deals with your treatment of the teeny punk, as you call us, bands, referring to SOA, Minor Threat, Youth Brigade, No Authority, GI, Teen Idols, Untouchables, and other still forming bands that you will no doubt lump in with the rest of us. The fact that you refuse to accept us as individual bands shows a great weakness in the aspect of your magazine. We may all be friends, we may share many of the same beliefs, we may have the same energies, but none of us are identical in sound or style." Harper responded with her own letter defending her zine and herself from the criticisms, and urging those who took issue with the content of her zine to join her in making the zine better. Her quote, "If Capital Crisis is to continue as a useful catalyst, then it deserves more participation from its readers and fellow music enthusiasts." Indeed, Harper and some of the younger punks did team up to work on a 5th issue of Capital Crisis, which was published in May 1981, but it wound up being the final issue of that zine. And more zines were emerging as the hardcore scene grew. There was Sarah Woodell's Now What in November 1981, and Sab Gray's Skinflint, which came up in 1982. Sharon Cheslow, an important figure in the scene as a disc jockey and musician in the bands Chalk Circle and later in Bloody Mannequin Orchestra and Suture. She collaborated with Colin Sears, who was later in the band Dag Nasty, to publish a new zine in 1982 called If This Goes On, which ran for 3 issues. Thrill Seeker, which also debuted in 1982, had one of the biggest impacts on the scene, which was now seeing concerts from the bands like Minor Threat and Government Issue draw huge crowds from all over the DC area. Thrill Seeker was co-edited by Tony Lombardi and Steve Kiviat, and was packed with interviews, photos, and reviews, helping to spread the word on the scene around the country. And along with Thrill Seeker, Truly Needy was one of the essential early DC punk zines and was a defining document of those peak hardcore years. As filmmaker Scott Crawford told me when I interviewed him in 2017, Thrill Seeker and Truly Needy were hefty 100-plus page zines that were, quote, like the Vanity Fair of the DC punk scene. As with comparably sized big-name national punk scenes like Flipside and Maximum Rock and Roll, when new issues of Thrill Seeker and Truly Needy came along, everybody made sure to pick one up. Edited by Barbara Rice, Truly Needy ran for 10 issues from 1982 to 1985, and they were all packed with interviews with locals like Minor Threat, Velvet Monkeys, No Trend, Rites of Spring, and also out-of-towners like Jello Biafra, The Fall, Husker Du, and lots of other zines started to come out at this time. So during that hardcore boom of 1982 to 1984, there's Mike Ross's Brand New Age, there's D-Scene by Bobby Jones and Stuart Hill, and Stuart later went on to play bass in the band Shudder to Think. Zone 5 was another new zine at this time, and that was the work of Jim Saw, who was a young photographer in the scene at the time. Zone 5 showcased his outstanding photography of bands like Marginal Man, The Faith, Black Market Baby, and they're mixed in with interviews with bands like Black Flag and Big Boys. And throughout 1983 and 1984, more and more fanzines began publishing. In the case of Touch and Go, it had already existed in Michigan for a few years before briefly calling DC home during this period. And Metro Zine, the zine in the middle, that was a ragged cut and paste zine put together by 12-year-old Scott Crawford, who I mentioned earlier. And Scott's zine ultimately got up to a 20th issue before shutting down in 1987. Though years later, he would collaborate with Jim Saw on the DC hardcore punk documentary, Salad Days. WDC Period was another relatively long-running DC punk scene. And this one was helmed by Gordon Ornelas, who went by the alias Gordon Gordon. And his first issue, full of writings on punk, mingled with crude drawings and crude humor, emerged in 1984. But before its final issue in 1988, it had become a relatively polished, larger format zine, not totally unlike the late 70s zines like D-Scenes and The Infiltrator, but Gordon Gordon's twisted sense of humor never really went away, no matter how slick the zine's layout became. So 1985 was a crucible point for the DC punk subculture. As the hardcore scene grew crowded and violent, it alienated many musicians and scene participants. So a group of new bands like Rites of Spring and Embrace emerged, offering up a version of punk that rejected the ritualized violence of hardcore in favor of something more melodic and lyrically introspective. And so just as these new bands and this new sound was cropping up, so did more new zines. Off Center was a zine driven by Kevin Mattson and Mark Anderson, both of whom helped establish Positive Force DC, the long-running activist group with deep ties to the DC punk scene. Off Center ran for 6 issues from 1985 to 1988, with Mattson departing after the first few issues. Yet Another Unslanted Opinion was a new zine from the suburb of Burke, Virginia, which ran for 5 issues over that 1985 to 1986 period and had a deep DC focus, interviewing many of the bands that were recharging the scene at the time, like Dag Nasty, Beefeater, Embrace, Rites of Spring, and Scream. There were more zines that were beginning to emerge in the mid-1980s that displayed a strong influence of comics. And the Boogans and Duckburg Times weren't like punk fanzines per se, but were both clearly steeped in the punk subculture. Duckburg Times was also the launching pad for the aforementioned Gordon Gordon's fantastic one-sheet zine, Chow Chow Times, in which he would draw a monthly calendar of all the upcoming shows he was interested in attending, along with a rundown of other scene news. And another zine that combined that comics influence, but with a type of slicker, more professional layout, was Greed. And this zine, edited by Kurt Sienga, was a product of the increasing access that people were getting to desktop publishing software through home computers. And in Sienga's case, he used the computer after hours at his place of work until he lost that job. But over the course of 6 issues from 1986 to 1989, Kurt interviewed Rites of Spring, Pussy Galore, Robin Hitchcock, Tommy Keene, and many more, profoundly broadening the aesthetic possibilities of a DIY punk scene with his graphic design skills. And through the late 80s, the zine scene continued to thrive. There were newer titles like Disaster, which was edited by Bill Callahan, who later became well known for his music under the name Smog. There was Brad Siegel's Nomadic Underground, Shauna Kenny's No Scene, and Eric Rotz's Action Time. Sharon Cheslow also returned to the zine world in 1989 with Interrobang, closing out the decade with another thoughtful and insightful collection of interviews and writings on music. 2 other standout zines of this period, as the 80s ebbed into the 90s, were Sweet Portable U and Whack. And Sweet Portable U was edited by Patrick Foster, and it was an incredible production. Usually just a single sheet of double-sided legal-size paper, though sometimes he would staple two sheets together. The issues, they were sometimes churned out weekly over the course of the run of the zine, which was from 1989 to 2000. And the writing style was hilariously abstract and absurd, and often authored by writers named Dr. Sweaterback or Walking Dude. The reviews in the zine subverted the often self-serious tone of music criticism, offering up these bizarrely humorous stream of consciousness rambles that often didn't even refer back to the album that was purportedly being reviewed at all. Whack, which was edited by Rob Myers, was a much more straight-ahead publication, and it recalled some of those early newsprint tabloid DC music zines like D-Scenes. But the spot color covers and the slick design really helped Whack stand out. So by 1991, a new wave of musicians and zine editors were at the heart of the scene, most notably members of the bands Bikini Kill and Bratmobile, who were injecting the zine scene with a massive dose of creativity, intensity, and innovation. Bikini Kill created their own eponymous zine, within which members would author searingly powerful personal writings. And likewise, the Riot Girl zine served as an eponymous forum for participants in the massively influential feminist punk movement that grew out of the scenes in DC and Olympia, Washington, right around that time. So another zine to emerge from that scene was Red Rover, created by Jen Smith. Smith's offhand use of the phrase "Girl Riot" in a 1991 letter to Bratmobile's Alison Wolfe inspired the name of the Riot Girl movement, though as Jen told me when I interviewed her last year, I am credited with that, which is sweet, but my naming of it was not a naming. It was just sort of plucked from correspondence and became the zeitgeist that it was. Action Teen and Teenage Gang Devs were both created by Erin Smith of Bratmobile in collaboration with her brother Don, Action Teen featured interviews with the likes of Fugazi, Beat Happening, and Unrest, whereas Teenage Gang Debs was an unabashed fanzine, centered on television and pop culture of the 60s and 70s, the sort that was typically dismissed as kitsch, but had a fervent cult of admirers like the Smith siblings. And the Nation of Ulysses, who were one of the more formidable kinetic bands of the DC punk scene at the turn of the 90s, they created their own zine/newsletter. Also, it was overflowing with ideas, sly humor, political rhetoric. Ulysses Speaks was the ideal complement to the band's music, putting their ideas down on paper to make the revolution a bit more portable. So Fake Fanzine was edited by Irene Chen, who I went to high school with and was a big influence on me. Irene had attended Riot Girl meetings and was awed by the energy and inspiration that radiated out of the people participating in it. And she only did one zine or one issue of Fake, but it's a powerful and aesthetically sharp blend of interviews with bands like Nation of Ulysses, Bikini Kill, Circus Lupus, and writings on race, sexism, and subculture. And the increasing ease that I mentioned earlier of access to better desktop publishing software like PageMaker and Quark Express, not to mention Kinko's being on seemingly every corner, led to an explosion of fanzines throughout the 90s. So Steve Shapiro's Who Cares, which was a really smart, opinionated zine that covered DC punks like Unrest and Gray Matter, as well as music from elsewhere like My Bloody Valentine. And Steve also went to my high school, and along with Fake, gave me a template to follow when I wanted to do my own zine, which was Slanted, which is there. And so that was my zine that I did in high school, and that ran from 93 to 1995. And there were more zines like Jeff Bogato's Mole and Mark Masters' Crank, which explored outsider sounds that rarely found coverage anywhere. But that was a trait that became more and more interesting as punk and alternative music moved into the mainstream throughout the 90s. Not Even was the work of Daisy Rooks, whose writings crackled with a restless brilliance, I thought, whether she was interviewing bands or writing on politics or music and feminism. Nerd Girl emerged from the Northern Virginia suburbs around 1994 and was a really endearingly fanish fanzine that sang the praises of indie rock and indie pop, especially anything related to the musician Mary Timony. And that zine boom, there were so many things happening at that time, but a few of those zines were long-running ones like Punk Life, which still publishes today. Jim Saw of Zone 5 zine came back with a new zine called Uno Mas, which ran for 13 issues from 1990 to 1997. There was Jason Rose, Killed a Robot, which mostly published while he was off of college, but it collected his writings on music, sexuality, veganism, and other aspects of his life into a really compelling zine. There was Jeff Ferris and Tina Henry's Restaurant Fuel, a really creative and clever zine that offered up handmade touches like duct tape binding, which you can see on the edge there. And they would sometimes include a mini zine within the zine, sort of just letting you into their lives a bit more. Brick Thrower was an explicitly political zine that was put together by members of the band The Stigmatics. And they were really inspired by their neighborhood, life in their neighborhood of Mount Pleasant. And the women behind that zine sought to inspire action with their words, and they succeeded. They combined activism and wit and intelligence to make one of the best DC zines of the decade, I thought. Walona Sloan's Scorpion ran from 1996 to about 2002, and combined interviews with musicians, along with her writings on race, punk, feminism, and life during and after college. And I interviewed Walona in 2018, and as she told me at the time, one of the things I'm extremely proud of as a female, as a woman of color, there just weren't a lot of other zines doing what I was doing. And I felt like that was a space that I could inhabit. And I was really happy to see people come around to that and understand what I was trying to do, even though it didn't fit into the little categories of zines that people did. So music zines jammed with in-depth interviews and reviews were still in abundance as the 1990s moved into the 2000s. There was Chris Richards' Torpedo Dialogues, and there was my zine, Held Like Sound, which ran from 1996 to 2001. But the growth of the internet in the early 2000s severely curtailed the production of fanzines. And thinking back to that time, I remember the feeling was generally like, why pay hundreds of dollars or more to put out a zine when I can just write all of this on the internet for free? Now, Give Me Back was one of the rare print DC punk zines in the mid to late 2000s, which was great, but it wasn't until later in the 2010s that print punk zines started to come back. And the general zine community made a really inspiring return to relevance in general throughout the 2010s. And punk zines like Strawberry Dreams, which is a collaboration between Paula Martinez, Faris Geike, and John Scharbach, and Shining Life, which was a solo zine by Scharbach, merged visual elements of older punk zines with the immediacy and verve of DC punk in the 2010s, which I thought was at a creative and energetic height that I hadn't seen in probably 20 years. So even now, with outlets like Twitter and Instagram, there's still a place for DC punk scenes, I think. Chris Richards' return to zines, WC Ringtone, provides short, thoughtful writings on music and culture, and new zines like Potion for Bad Dreams and Demystification embody everything that is good about zines. They show the joy and fandom and the dedication and creativity inherent in making a publication out of it. So what lies ahead in the 2020s, who knows? But I think that as long as punk rock lives in DC, DC will continue to create punk rock scenes. So thank you. And I know I blitzed through that one, but there's my email address on there, and there is an Instagram account, UMB Punk Collections, that features flyers and zines from our punk collections. Certainly if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask or drop a line anytime. Chat here. All right. So I guess before I go, I mean, if anybody has any questions, I think maybe we have a minute. I don't know.
Yeah, John, we have a couple minutes. There was one question that someone threw in here. Bethany shared the archives to the UMD repository, so people are looking at that. But someone asked about if they were accessible online, so that was answered. But a comment about kind of the evolution of these zines aesthetically. And I'm kind of curious as well around if there's any difference in terms of kind of the aesthetic for DC versus other geographies, if you've looked at that at all.
I didn't think so really, but it just seemed like it was sort of like, it was always about what sort of technology was available the whole way until you get into the 21st century, when it kind of becomes a rejection of whatever technology is available. And that's just sort of one of the interesting and refreshing things about zines from now, is that we got to this point where it's kind of like, okay, we can do so much, but like, let's see what we can do with a bit less. Like, how can we connect to people? How can we express ourselves in a different way than what we're doing all the time in our daily lives? And I think that's just sort of one of the most compelling things about zines now, is that it is not like it's not a total repudiation of technology, but it's just sort of like, let's try something different. Let's harken back a little bit to some of what was cool from before, but like, we're not going to completely mimic it. We're just going to sort of draw inspiration. But that was this sort of interesting track it took. It was like technology, 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 and like other way.
That's fascinating. So we did get one more question, which is, there's some curiosity about the prints behind you.
Yeah, just some art, nothing fancy. But yeah, so you can email me and I'll tell you where we got them and who the artist is and all that.
Okay, great, awesome. So, well, thank you so much. And we will be sharing those resources on the webpage as well that were discussed today. So thank you so much, John.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And I see Ben Boyer, and Ben Boyer, I love you.